this off to Jeff Letterman. He's going to start off our program today.
Welcome, everybody. Really excited to have you here. It's fun to talk about fishing, and we get to talk about our favorite lures, so that's really exciting. Real quick agenda. Benji just covered the logistics on using WebEx, and we'll just spend a few minutes on introductions here, and then we'll jump right into our favorite lures, what, when, where, how we use them, give you a couple of hopefully good techniques. I like to say these are big secrets, but they're not, but we'll hopefully give you something that's brand new for you to learn. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions. Again, my name is Jeff Letterman. I'm our aquatic and fishing education supervisor at DNR in Fish and Wildlife. I am a former instructor for our aquatic education program. I actually worked several summers at Camp Fish, fishing camp all summer long, and got some good experience and was excited to lead some of the campers to victories. I'm going to give you that secret lure that we use to win those events. And I did the Fishing Daughters Club many years ago to get girls, getting them engaged in fishing, and been in the past done a lot of local bass fishing leagues, and or one particular league which I've got some success from. So I'll give you that technique that worked the best for that. And I'm going to walk through here. We'll introduce some of the other folks, our experts that are with us, that are DNR staff. But Mandy is our professional on her spare time out of work. She does a lot of great fishing. And so, Mandy, tell us a little bit about your background. To unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself, Mandy.
Whoops.
There we go. Perfect.
Currently, I'm the Habitat Program Administrator for the Fish and Wildlife Division. This past month, I hit 21 years with the state of Minnesota. But like you said, when I'm not at work, I am on the water. I fish open water and ice fishing, but I do fish quite a bit of tournaments, 20 to 30 a year. You can see me on TV or you can hear me on the radio pretty much every weekend. 16 weeks a year you can see the TV show, but this is when I'm not at work. My other passion, obviously, is talking about fishing or actually doing it.
Oh, we're really excited to have you here, Mandy. Thanks for joining us. Next, we have Craig Kiger, our Northwoods guru. Craig, why don't you introduce yourself? You're muted also. Thank you. Oh, no, there you go.
Okay, so Craig Kiger, I'm normally your shooting sports coordinator for the DNR, but you can only shoot so many months out of the year, so fishing backfilled those available times. I've done quite a bit of walleye fishing up here in the Northland. I mean, within just a short drive of my house, I'm on some of the best walleye waters in the state. And my favorite lure today I'm going to talk about is going to be the jig. So welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, and river and lake fishing up there in Grand Rapids. What a wonderful place to grow up and catch a lot of fish. All right, Benji, unmute. Next is Benji.
All right, I'm Benji Cohen. I don't have near the experience of Mandy. I'm only here, I think this is my third year at the DNR. So, but I'm the outreach specialist and mentor network coordinator in the Fish and Wildlife Outreach section. I grew up in the southern half of Minnesota, so my favorite way to fish is fly angling. So I enjoy that. Spent a lot of years out in Colorado going to school, and after school out there, got into fly fishing and moved back and kind of continue that. And the great fisheries we have in flyover country, which I prefer to keep it that way so we don't get a whole ton of people trout fishing in Minnesota and Wisconsin, because I like to keep it our little secret here. But I think we have the best between the east and the west areas for sure. So,
and you have a really great. I'm sorry.
I was going to say I also spent several years with Trout Unlimited. I still volunteer there, led their education program for a few years, and still pretty involved with my local chapters. So.
Yeah, and you have a unique, well, not unique, but a technique that I think everybody can use. Will be really fun to talk about. So let's jump into our favorite lures. Mandy's up first, and she's got live bait rigs, which I think many of us all grew up. That's how dad or grandpa or uncle or mom took us out, and we dragged some live bait around to try and mostly catch walleyes. But I know, Mandy, you've got a lot of different ideas on that. So take it away.
I know a lot of people associate me with bass fishing. I picked the Lindy rig because I think it's one of the most versatile baits there is for multiple species. It's cheap with components to put together yourself. You can have fun with it. You can use different kinds of baits, minnows, leeches, night crawlers, and you can catch a multitude of different species on it. I did actually grow up, this was one of my first lures. I'm from the Devil's Lake area. My dad was a guide on Devil's Lake, so I spent a lot of time hand tying multiple different kinds of Lindy rigs, but still to this day, if I'm taking kids out or clients for guiding or just going fun fishing on my own, I can guarantee you I've got a Lindy rig tied up in the boat. So you can see the pictures that are on the screen, and there's multiple different variations of the Lindy rig in itself. But there's some basics to it. So you're going to have your main line, and I'm going to start that. So that's the line that's on your reel, actually. So with your reel, you're going to want a 2,000 to 3,000, and that just talks about line capacity. But then we talk about the Lindy rig itself, which is also referred to as a snell. So that snell line usually is going to be mono or fluorocarbon, and the length is totally going to differ. You can see on there that they list 2 feet to 5 feet. Realistically, there's a couple components that play into that. A good rule of thumb is the clearer the water, the longer the snell should be, and that's going to be the distance from where your weight is to where the actual hook and the bait is. I'm normally in that 5 to 8 foot range for the majority of what I'm fishing. I've seen quite a few walleye derbies won on Lindy rigs with long snells anywhere from 10 to 12 feet. If we start right at the beginning, where you connect your line to the weight. So you can see a couple different kinds of weights there. The Lindy rig actually gets its name from the weight itself. The Lindy rig was created in 1968 by Linders right here in Brainerd, Minnesota, but the different kind of weights didn't actually come out till a little bit later. So the walking one, which is like a little L-shaped weight here that will show at the end, or you can use like a no snag weight. When you're connecting those, you're going to put that on your line first. Then you're going to run a bead. People want to know, why do you run a bead? So there's 2 different reasons. It keeps with smaller swivels for that weight sliding over the top, and 2, it'll help keep that line straight, and we'll talk about why that's important. So next you're going to tie on your swivel. There's different kinds of swivels. You can do a snap swivel or a straight swivel. The most important thing is if you're going to do a direct tie, or if you're going to purchase, you can buy pre-made Lindy rigs already. Use a snap swivel because there's already a loop on there, and you can quickly just put it on there and snap it on. Now we go to the length. We talked about that a little bit, right? If you're going to use mono or if you're going to use fluorocarbon, what length you're going to use. I would say anywhere in clear water, we said deeper. Current comes into play too, more on the river. If you're in heavy current on the river, I would say actually use a shorter snell length. That 2 to 5 feet would actually be better, and you ask why. Because that current's going to want to carry that bait higher in the water column. So one, you're going to need to adjust the weight to keep that bait down towards the bottom. The most important thing at any depth that you're at, or at any speed that you're going, if you're trolling, if you're drifting, is to make sure that you adjust the weight so it's actually sitting on the bottom. Here's a really good rule of thumb, because people are like, I don't know what weight that I need. If you start with the depth that you're fishing, if you're in less than 10 feet of water, a 1/4 ounce weight. If you are in 10 to 20 feet of water, you can bump up to a 1/2 ounce weight. 20 feet of water, you bump up to a 3/4 ounce weight. Anything over 25, 30 feet, you can go to an ounce. Same thing applies with that heavier weight. Obviously in the current, you're probably going to start at a 3/4 and might even bump up all the way to 2 ounces, which sounds crazy, but trust me, the Rainy River's raging right now, and those guys are using 2 to 4 ounce weights to keep their baits at the bottom. So then we get to the end and we're like, what do we want to put on there? Let's talk about the different kinds of hooks. So you can fish anything from walleye to bass to pike. You can even catch crappie on these, but you need to adjust your size of hook and your bait. So the octopus hook, they're a little bit different. The larger the size of it is actually the smaller of the hook. So if you want to fish let's say with a small minnow, a night crawler, or a leech. So when I say small minnow, I'm under 3 inches. You're going to want to go with that 4 to 6 aught hook. If you want to fish a 4 to a 5-inch minnow, maybe you like using big red tails or suckers, you're going to want to bump up to a 1-aught or a 2-aught hook. Then we talk about the different kinds of baits. We'll start with minnows. So there's 3 basic ways to hook that bait onto that hook. So you can lip hook them, and some people will go through the bottom and all the way through the top and lip hook them. Or you can also go directly just through the top and come up for the bony portion between the eyes. Try not to shove it through the head. Second method is to hook the hook actually on the side by the dorsal, or 3, you can actually hook it through the tail right behind the dorsal. So I like the first method through the lips if you're trolling. If you're drifting and or stationary fishing, I like that dorsal or tail hook because it lets that minnow be much more natural and swim on its own when you're not pulling it through a water column like you would be for trolling. So if you're going to use a leech, which is also applicable with this bait, you just take that hook and you hook it right through the sucker portion of it. And then as that's traveling, you're trolling through the water, that leech sprawls out nice and long. If you're going to use a night crawler, there's 2 different options. You can use the regular 1 hook, like we talked about, a smaller aught, a 4 to a 6, and you hook it right through the snout on the meaty portion of that night crawler. There are Lindy rig night crawler rigs that like you see below on that screen where it's actually got 2 hooks. So you're going to hook one through the main collar, which is the thicker portion, the head of the night crawler. And then you're just going to naturally, wherever that second hook falls on that night crawler, depending on the length for the second line, you're going to hook it through there. So that comes into play when you're trolling and you get those finicky walleyes that want to just kind of nip at the tail as you're going and aren't taking that bait altogether and hammering on it. So we'll jump from there into ways to fish them. I said trolling, drifting, or stationary. So a good rule of thumb with trolling, here again, whatever speed, depth you're going, you got to make sure that weight's on the bottom. You want a 45-degree angle from the weight to the end of your line as you're going. 3 rules of thumb. Spring, you're going to want to slow down anywhere from 0.2 miles an hour to 1 mile an hour. Summertime, you can actually speed up a little bit. You can go all the way up to 1.5 miles an hour with trolling. And then fall, we're going to fall back again a little bit more to, I like a 0.5, maybe to a 1.1 speed. And you're going to want to go, we start with minnows. Then you kind of transition in the summer, you can transition to leeches or night crawlers. And then normally in the fall, I'll transition back to a minnow again, and normally a larger minnow. They're really putting on that fall feed bag for them. When you're fishing them, last key, and this is the biggest key. When you're trolling, and I see this all the time, have your bail open. So when I'm talking about a bail on a spinning reel, it's like this. This is closed, this is open. So when your bail is open, you're actually keeping your finger on the line itself. And when you feel that bite, it might be a tick, it might be a big pull, you're gonna let that line go out. So what happens there is that weight stays stationary on the bottom where the line now is free going. So that fish bites it and grabs the line, and it kind of runs with it. It doesn't feel any resistance, so it's more likely to eat that bait in its entirety. Where if the bail is closed and that hook bites, it's going to feel the resistance of you on there and more likely to drop that bait itself. You're going to have to play with it a little bit, how finicky those fish are or how aggressive they are for how much line you're going to let out. If they're really aggressive, it might be 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, close the bail, a couple reels, set the hook. If they're super finicky or if you have a very large bait, a large minnow on there, you're going to want to give them more time. You might be counting to 6 or 7 or 8 and feeding them that line before you close the bail, reel up, and set the hook. But I think that's going to be my lure choice for this opener going out for sure. I'm going to catch some walleyes, hopefully. And hopefully, if you guys have any questions, you can catch me on the end, but get out and use that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mandy. Great tips. And so to summarize, if you're going out Saturday morning, what would you suggest for like leader length and bait and things like that for walleyes on Saturday morning or the opener?
For opener, here, like I said, it depends on how clear that body of water is. I would say a really good rule of thumb is 5 to 8. A mono or fluorocarbon, a smaller minnow perhaps, because they're post spawn now. They're a little bit finicky. They're going to start putting that feed bag on. So a 4 to 6/0 hook and probably a 3 to 3.5 inch minnow of your choice.
Great, excellent. And you know, you talked about feeding the line or letting the line out, and the sliding sinker is what's really key for this rig, right? For the line to be able to go through that hole in that sinker.
Correct, absolutely, and that's why you'll see on there where we have that bead. We'll have to try and show it at the ends, but
Sure.
they're not the clip weights. They have a specific hole in them so that yes, that line slides freely through there. So there's not a heavy weight sitting on the end of that line.
And the fish has no clue until you set the hook.
Correct.
Thanks, Mandy. It's great. I love the information you had too about the size of sinker that you should use. That's the first time I've heard that. That's a great suggestion. Okay, let's move on. Next lure. Craig is up, and Craig, you have. Let's see if I can advance here. Okay. Now probably it's going to go past multiple slides, but Craig, you have picked the jig, and I will say I worked at Camp Fish, and Al Lindner came up, and others from the celebrities from In Fisherman when they owned it at the time, and this question was asked all the time: "What's your favorite lure, Al?" And he would always say, "If I had to pick one lure, it's the jig." So you're in good company. Let's hear about it.
So we're going to probably open up on a northern Minnesota lake here, fairly clear water. And I've always fished with the jig up there. When I was a kid, Mandy, I fished with Lindy rigs all the time. And when I got old enough to make my own decisions in the boat, and it took a while because my dad still liked to be the captain of the boat, we switched over to the jigs. And I don't know if you guys can see that on there, but it's a fairly small, short hook shank, usually tipped with a shiner minnow. And I like to feel the contact of the bottom. There's some sandy spots on that lake where you'll actually feel the ripples in the sand as you're dragging that minnow up. And sometimes they like it fished very, very slow. Sometimes they like a little bit more hop to the jig, or almost a vertical presentation where you're fishing straight down from the edge of the boat. As to Mandy's point about the size of the jig, here's a pretty big one. If I'm fishing a river with a lot of current, I'm going to want a little bit bigger jig size to keep contact with the bottom. A lot of my jigs are glow in the dark color because I think that helps the walleyes pick up that movement. You know, and versus going to a real dark jig with a lot of hair and feathers on it, like this one. I don't fish with the marabou jigs very often. I've got a few in the tackle box, but usually it's a jig and a shiner minnow. And shiners are going to be kind of tough to come by up north because the ice has just gone out and they haven't started moving into the shallows. Another unique presentation for the jig is the stand-up jigs. And that presents the bait up off the bottom so that the fish can find it a lot easier. And just like Mandy was saying with the Lindy rigs, I'll fish with an open bail and my finger on the line. And when I feel that fish pick the bait up, I'll let go of the line and give it a count of, 2 to 3 and see if, I can catch the fish in that. If next time I'll go a little bit longer and take up the slack, set the hook. And one of the things that we got introduced to a few years ago, and you can find them in your bait shops, they come in a couple different lengths. And I don't know if you guys can hopefully see that. That's a stinger hook combination. It's got a little rubber grommet on it that goes over your hook, and then you bring that stinger back by the tail. It does impede the movement of the bait a little bit, but for those real finicky walleyes that want to just bite at the tails, and I don't know if you guys have ever had that, you feel a good bite and you go to set the hook and you bring in a minnow without a tail. This will help put fish in the boat. So I'll probably be out there Saturday with a jig and hopefully a shiner minnow and giving that a try.
Yeah, and good tip about the stinger hook, and that also allows you to set the hook quicker, and you have less risk of getting deep deep hooks or hurting the fish as much. So Mandy touched on this about the water being cold and the fish not as active, probably some of them still coming off, maybe some even actually in spawning, but they'll probably be pretty shallow, right, this weekend?
The spot where I'll probably fish from, it's maybe knee-deep water with a deep drop, and I can work that bait right up that drop, and nice slow retrieve, hopping it up the bank, and that's usually where the fish get stacked up with. If the wind turns around and goes the other direction, then we gotta go across the other bay and fish that. I've caught fish all year round with the jigs, and one of the things Mandy talked about it, but that's a floating jig, and you can fish that like with the Lindy rig, and it gets your bait up off the bottom, so when the weeds come in, I like to use that one.
I know you don't fish for bass, but I've heard jigs are good for bass too. Mandy, I bet you used a jig a lot for bass fishing, and plastics probably, right?
I've got lots of jigs, yes.
So yeah, it's a really versatile, a great, and then it works really well in the winter time too. You use it in the winter time, right, Craig?
Yep, I've got a number of jigs that I brought along that are smaller for panfish and crappies, airplane jigs for vertical fishing for trout, the little ice flies, which are basically still a jig, but they're very, very small, and putting a waxy on those for panfish in the wintertime, but they're pretty tiny. And so like I said, it's a hook that I use throughout the year. Summertime, I talked with Jeff about this yesterday. I was introduced to this by a good friend of mine. And I said, where's the minnow bucket? And he said, we're not fishing with minnows. We're fishing with night crawlers. And I said, night crawlers on a jig? I've never heard of it. And he cut the worms in half, and we put a half a worm on the jigs, half a night crawler, and fished it vertically in the channel, and drifted with the current. And I couldn't believe the walleyes we caught on half a night crawler. I do use leeches occasionally, and just like Mandy said, you hook them up through the lip, through the sucker part, and fish them back slow. But normally that first few weeks of opening season, they're looking for a minnow lunch, and that's why I would probably go with that.
Yeah, and I want to mention too, we're seeing a lot more alternative weighted material for the jig head. It used to always be lead, which we know there's issues with that in the environment and birds especially. So there's some great tungsten out there, which actually performs really great because it's more dense, and so in some cases it's actually a better, more effective jig to use too. And there's some bismuth, some other alternatives. So encourage people to look for those alternative options in jig heads too. All right, we're going to move on to the next one. Thanks, Craig. I'm up next, and my favorite is spinnerbait. Basically, a spinnerbait is a jig on a V-shaped wire, as you see in those photos, with spinning blades. There are all kinds of varieties. It can be a rubber skirt, or even just like a tube skirt. You don't even have to have a skirt necessarily. You could put live bait on it. So they're extremely versatile. I love them because they're so easy to use, especially for new anglers. You can cast them out, slowly retrieve them in, or you control them. And the really great thing about them for new anglers is that they're essentially weedless. They ride in the water with the weight down, and so the hook is up, and it actually avoids a lot of the weeds from that perspective. And then because they're streamlined coming through the water with the jig head in front and the blades, it pushes a lot of the weeds out of the way. So in many cases, you can put them through, above, or over the top of weeds, and really avoid getting snagged very much, which is great for new anglers. And then they also tend to be very flashy, big attraction, so it really triggers the active fish, which we want to find those fish that we know are actively feeding. You can cover a lot of territory with the spinnerbait. I'm going to highlight 2 specific techniques or options, and these come in a lot of different sizes, and you see that on the screen. But start with the smallest size, and here's a little jig here, which people typically have called these beetle spins. This one I think is a 1/8, but they come even. I would suggest potentially starting with a 16th ounce, and I troll with them. Again, you want to right size your line because you're using a small lure, so you're going to use lighter line, 4-6 pound test, maybe only, smaller reel, and lighter rod, because we're going to go after the smaller fish, and in this case it's deadly for crappies. And so especially in late spring or early summer, over the top of the weeds, submerged weeds, or weed flats, or on the outside edge of the weeds, crappies are going to be all along, in many lakes, be along those weed edges or just above the weeds. And with kids especially, you can take each one, 2 or 3, you can have these out on either side of the boat, have them cast it out as far as they can go. One good cast, and just flip the bail over, put their finger on it so they can feel it, and let the boat do the work. I usually trap about 1 mile an hour, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, with my trolling motor, and kids just got to hold on, and you're going to catch fish. And that's the technique I was talking about that I won at Camp Fish, all of the tournaments where we had points for crappies. And you can, when there's a good crappie population and they're active, you're going to catch a lot of fish. So that's one really simple, easy technique. And then let's flip to the larger size. Again, this time we're talking 1/4 ounce, 3/8 is kind of the standard for bigger fish. This is for bass and northerns. This one I believe is 3/8, up to even a half or bigger. If you're going after muskies, you may be 1 ounce or 2 ounces. But this is a really effective technique most of the year, but especially again in early summer. The fish are up shallow. It's easy to manage these baits. There's not as many weeds. You can go over the weed tops. Basically, find weeds. We call them cabbage, commonly anglers, but we're talking about pond weed. Bulrushes and reeds are good, and milfoil before it gets too thick, or the native milfoil, which doesn't get the big thick mats. You can go right over the top. Hit these weed flats and weed edges, and you're going to catch a lot of big fish. My picture earlier, that's the biggest fish I ever caught, was on a white spinnerbait. So it's really effective and a great way to cover area, find a lot of active fish, and catch a lot of fun fish. You may even hook a walleye, Craig. Even once in a while, you can catch a walleye on a spinnerbait, and bowfin or dogfish too. I've got a couple of nice ones of those with spinnerbait. So, one other tip: summer. Again, northerns love these. They tend to move into the colder water as it gets hot during the summer. They still relate to the weeds in our central Minnesota lakes that have a lot of weed growth, and fish them deeper. Let it sink. You get that spinnerbait, you can cast it out, let it sink down 10, 15 feet where the fish are, you're going to get bit. Just a nice, slow, easy retrieve back after you've cast it out, and let it sink, count to 10. You're going to vary and figure out how deep that is, but stay again right above those weeds in deep water, and you're going to find the northerns in deep water in the middle of the summer too. So there's another tip. All right, we're going to move on to the next, unless anyone had anything to add on that. We can ask, we will do question and answer, but Benji's up next with his favorite, and it is, of course, artificial flies. But I think we'll talk about how anybody can use this technique, right, Benji? On spinning tackle, even.
I got to be the odd man out a little bit. So, like I was saying, I grew up in southern Minnesota, and then when I moved out west, it gets hard to keep live bait around, especially when you're in an apartment or working all day and you want to stop by the stream on the way home. And that was kind of the impetus of me getting into fly fishing. I just stopped by Roaring Judy Fish Hatchery and fished one of their ponds, and met a couple people there that were doing the same things. And I'm like, well, this fly fishing business is kind of nice with these artificial baits. So, and one of my favorite is a pheasant tail nymph. As you can see here, there's a few different varieties of them. But just, and like everybody said, Mandy said too, keep it close to the bottom, and Craig said that you want to keep them on the bottom. Same with Jeff, let it sink to the bottom. Same thing with artificial flies. If you got this is actually the fly I caught, pheasant tail nymph. There's no weight on the top of that. It's probably hard to see because they're small. fishing everything's, that's a size 12, I believe. So they're small little hooks, but I add weight to the line to get those down there. So you get little tiny things. Somebody asked about lead-free tackle and stuff. I buy a lot of water gremlin and other lead-free weights and weight your fly down. Sometimes it takes 3-4 of them on a line to get that little tiny fly down there. But obviously I'm not a big boat fisherman. I don't fish in a boat. I don't have a boat that I go out in big water with, usually small stuff. So I'm jigging a little bit here and there, but a lot of my stuff is small streams fishing, and the fish pitcher at the start was a steelhead I caught out in Pennsylvania with that fly I just showed you. So you can catch a pretty good sized fish on some really tiny little flies. So, but I think the key is getting it down to the bottom. In the lower right there, you can see a pheasant tail nymph that's got a bead head on it. That helps in there. It's got some wire wrapped around it. It helps it sink a little bit faster. You can talk about trout all day long and fishing those, but I think one of my favorite things when I had kids was to get them out with a little pheasant tail nymph or some other brightly colored thing in fish for panfish. So, and I use what I call it it's a Tenkara rod, but you can see I should turn my background off. It's a tiny little tip to it. It's like a ginormous cane pole. This little one is just a few feet long, but it stretches out to I think 10.5 feet. And I can sit on a dock or along a stream when the weeds are still close to shore and the crappies and the panfish are close to shore, and then just tie a little bead head on there. And even with some just monofilament running from virtually a stick, or you can even use a regular fishing pole, bait casting pole, or anything, just tie a line from the end of it and just drop it down 10 feet, and they can just reach out there and drop that straight into those weeds where the fish are. It's a great way and very effective to get in there. You're almost sight fishing the fish. So don't need any fancy equipment. Keeps your hands clean for those rare kids that don't like it and all dirty and gross. But
I have a fly rod and a fly reel, but I hardly ever use it. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up. You can put these on spinning rods and reels, right? On mono. It might not cast as well, but your point about the live bait, it's expensive. It doesn't last very long. It's messy, and these flies, the sunfish in particular, just love them. If you again in the Twin Cities where we have larger populations of fish that are maybe well, they're small. The fish are generally smaller, right? Especially at these public docks and stuff, because the big ones get caught. But if you have a small enough hook, you could just catch fish after fish after fish on these flies. So it's a great technique.
Yeah, it's great. Well, obviously you don't lose your bait. One of the problems I see a lot with kids out there fishing is the hook's a decent size circle hook, and one of two things happen: either it doesn't take the bait all the way, so they lose their bait, or they're swallowing the hook, and then you got other issues with that, right? You got either kill the fish or cut the line, or you got to dig in deep to get the hook out. I don't have that problem as much with these artificial flies because they're smaller, they're nibble on it. There's obviously no bait to strip off of it, so you get a little better hook on them and a little more success on that. And like you were pointing out with the flash too, I got this guy out in Colorado made these little things are Pistol Pete's. They got a little propeller on the front. They're great for casting out there a little bit, and you pull them back, let them sink, pull them back, and that little propeller starts going and spinning, and that's a pretty effective way. I like that for crappies too, to get that out a little bit deeper and let it sink in there. So
thanks, Benji. Yeah, some great suggestions, folks. Pick up a couple of flies and go try it. I think you'll be amazed at how many, especially bluegills and other panfish, you can catch. Okay, we have some sources. There are a lot of great learn to fish components on our website. Here's just a couple of different websites, and I think Benji, you're throwing some of those into the chat. But they are a great place to start. We've got by species, so if you want to learn how to catch walleye this weekend, check out the Go Fishing components or learn to fish and click on the walleye. You get all the details. In fact, there's a couple of videos in there on how to rig your own live bait rig or slip bobbers, which might be a technique you're using this weekend. So check those out, and then let's take some questions. I'm going to stop sharing.
We never did talk about who's going to read all the questions, but Joseph did ask about his 10-year-old son do some bank fishing in about 4 feet of water and patches of weeds. Crappies are all over the place and some small bass. What would give him a better chance? And Greg had a great answer in there. A small bobber and a hook with some live, like a live bait on it, just to drop in there. On parcel artificial flies, I like, the old cane pole type technique where you can go out there and drop a bead head or some kind of sparkly. Usually the brighter and the uglier thing you're dropping into weeds, the more success you have for some reason. I don't know that, but it seems like candy cane colored little fly seems to work really well. And that's a lot of fun because you can drop it. It's especially even later summer, you get those weeds growing up and there's like little holes in them. And it's really hard for a kid to be able to cast out there. Well, if I get a 10 or 15-foot cane pole, they can just reach out there and just drop it in and just go straight down and then jig it a little bit is a pretty effective way. Anybody else have any suggestions other than a bobber rig for weeds long and short?
I showed the beetle spin, the little spinner bait, especially again early in the season when the crappies are up shallower, and the larger ones you can definitely catch a lot if it's not too weedy. So that's a good early season bait also for crappies and big bluegills. I see we have a question about different color choices. Mandy, you want to start on that one? Talk about color for jigs?
Actually. So we talk about the color spectrum, and I talk about this a lot. Different species see different variations of color. With bass fishing, the comment that was on there is absolutely correct in clear water. It sounds odd, but on darker days, you actually want to throw a darker jig with a trailer. We're talking black, dark blue, anything that's ultraviolet that's really dark. And why you want to do that is because the deeper you go in the water column, the less light there is, even in pristine clear water. So what they're actually seeing is it's giving itself a better profile. They're seeing the profile of that bait. When it's light and it's bright, yes, you want to throw something that's much more natural looking. You can get away with the neons or the pinks, the reds, things like that. And that's also taken consideration is what depth you're fishing. Doesn't really come in too much to play for bass fishing when we're talking reds, but red, the color itself actually has the least power in the color spectrum. So in about 10 feet or deeper, the color red stops existing as you go down, and that's in clear water. So imagine if you're on a river or you're in tannic or turbid waters that's ultra stained, the color comes out of play. So yeah, that's, and if you go to walleye, there's been multiple studies done, and I don't want to ruin this because there's a scientist out of Canada that did years and years of research for what's the best color lures for walleyes. And there again, it does come into play. Obviously, walleyes see better at night in low light situations they do in bright lake because of the way their eyes are made. Glow in the dark, you can never go wrong in low light situations or at night. I definitely lean towards that pink or chartreuse when it comes to walleye.
All right, thank you. Craig, there's a question on knots. You got a particular knot you want to share? Favorite? You're muted.
There we go. So my favorite knot's probably the polymer knot. I'll do a variation. I'll run the line through the eye of the jig or the hook, make a loop, go around the main line 2 or 3 times, 4 times, and then back through the double loop, pulling everything down and tight, trimming off my excess. And if I'm doing to clip on for a clip on swivel, I'll usually just take and make an overhand loop, pull it through, and that's what I'll fish. And like Mandy said, you can adjust the length of that leader by whatever you're trying to get that bait up above the weeds on the bottom or make it more visible. So fishing a hook or a floating jig, that's what I'd probably do with those.
Yeah, that Palomar is my favorite too, or however you say it, Palomar. You can look that up. I'm sure there's all kinds of videos on the internet on how to tie them correctly. But my suggestion is learn a knot, learn how to do it right, and get really good at it, and then you're going to have more success. Benji, you have anything else you want to add on knots at all?
Yeah, I really like the Palmer knot too, and the improved clinch too is a standby. And
Especially for small lures.
Yeah, for those really small lures, I actually have a little. Oh, I do have it on my vest right here. I have this little tool that's got a little hook on, so I can hook real small flies to it, and then I can just spin that with that. One thing I like doing too is I'll leave that tag extra long, and then I can do two things with that. I can either put another fly on there, a small nymph on there, or I can put a little lead weight or a little non-lead weight on there to keep that closer to the bottom. So, and then if that weight gets caught and breaks off, I'm not losing my fly, which is kind of nice. So a couple different techniques to get it down there and fish. So
I'll jump in quick with that.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that everybody was talking about Palmer knot. A really good rule of thumb, if you're using braid and or a super line, that's the only way to go. You will pull your knot if you're using a fire line or a thicker braid even with an improved cinch. So if you're using anything besides mono or fluorocarbon, that hands down is the best knot to go. But it's a good universal knot too. It's one of the first ones that we teach most people.
Mm-hmm. And it works really well. Thank you. You want to tackle the fish and pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn stages, Mandy, too, when you know that? Or should we do a tag team?
Water temp.
Yeah.
So right now, more than likely, the pike have already spawned. So walleyes are coming in to spawn depending where you are in the state of Minnesota. If you're in a large body of water or small body of water, if it's deep, if it's shallow, it's all about the water temp for all of these species. So I would assume we're right now in the Brainerd Lakes area. We just had ice off about a week ago, but we have some water temps in some of these smaller bays that are already at 58 degrees. So the crappies are moving up already. We're going to see a lot of walleye moving to get ready to spawn if they haven't already. As that water temp continues to rise, we're going to see the crappies start to spawn, the sunnies, the bass, things like that. But there's some pretty specific key factors. And the main portion of it is with us, which is interesting in Minnesota, is water temp. Where if you were to go to Florida, because the water temp is fairly consistent, say with bass, they'll spawn multiple times a year, and it's based on the moon. So that's a good rule of thumb. Someone can quickly Google the exact temps for each species that they're looking at, but and you can get a pretty good idea. But the majority of them are moving up shallow when it's time to spawn.
Yeah, especially the panfish, the bass, you're going to see them on their nests. So they spend, a week or so on the males guarding the nests, and you will see them up there and their round depressions that they dig out and protecting their eggs. So you'll see those, and that's typically late May, early June in most of Minnesota, right? When the panfish and the bass are spawning.
Yeah, and we'll see right now too, specifically with bass, is the males move up before the females because they're kind of moving up when they're getting their little territories, getting their nests set up before the females come up. So if you hit a shoreline that's shallow and you're catching nothing but, we call them little bucks, those are the males. The females haven't moved up yet into get onto those spawning beds. So pull out a little bit deeper from where you're fishing and you can target some of those pre-spawn females.
And I'm going to give you this one too. Your favorite lure for bass?
Right now, for the next, I don't know how many weeks, I'm going to have a chatterbait in my hand. Pre-spawn bass, specifically chatterbaits. I love to go. Spinnerbaits can be good too. And it's all about the speed. And that's going to be based on the water temp. So the warmer the water, and that's just throughout the season, the faster that you can actually retrieve that bait. Bass specifically, their metabolism is based on water temperature. So when it's cold like this, they're kind of groggy, they're hungry, they want to put a feed bag on because they're about to move up and spawn, so they need the energy. But slow rolling that spinnerbait or a chatterbait is It's not coming out of my hands. And then I'll move into a jig. I'll pull a Craig Kiger and I'll be flipping 1/4 ounce to 1/2 ounce jigs in deep vegetation most of summer.
Can you briefly describe what a chatterbait is? I mean, it's kind of a spinnerbait, but it's got an inline, right? An inline
Correct. So
metal thing.
it's like a jig, and in the front it's got a little flutter spoon. And as it moves, instead of it like a spinnerbait where there's actual blades on there, it chatters. That's why they call it chatterbait, and it creates this crazy little action behind there. And it's even got a skirt, just like a spinnerbait, and you can run a trailer off the end of that. Normally, I'll run anywhere from a 3 to a 5 inch paddle tail, different colors on the end of it that mimics a minnow. But the bigger the blade on the front, it's a single piece, affects the movement of how tight or how big it wobbles as it goes through the water column. So it looks very realistic. It's got the flash, and it's got the vibration, which, bass are visual, and they use their vertical and lateral lines to feel that movement in the water too.
Great. And mine is spinnerbait we already talked about, but if I as we get later in the summer, as some of the bass are in shallow water in the really thick weeds and lily pads, I love fishing a weedless frog, imitation frog lure. That top water is just fantastic, especially early and late in the day. That's a lot of fun. Got to make sure you got heavy duty rods and reels and thick line though, because you throw a lure back in there, you got to be able to get it back out and be able to get the fish out when they hit. So you're talking 20-pound or more test and really big, even higher. Yeah. Stiff rods and reels that can really horse those fish out. So leaders, Craig, you have a particular leader that you use with pike, or?
There's a couple small lakes that we go on, and these things are just monsters in there. And I'll go with, 12-inch to a 3-foot leader, depending on what I'm trying to do there. The biggest fish that I've taken out of there was like 36 inches, and it took a live bait rig. And but yeah, some of those pike, especially when we were kids fishing the river, we all tied 12-inch steel leaders on, and then hooked our daredevils directly in there, and all we did was troll for pike back then. There was days that we wanted to catch pike, and there was days we didn't want to catch pike. But a steel leader is the only way to keep from getting bit off by some of those.
Yeah, especially with those baits that are smaller, and the bait, and you're talking big northerns, they one little cut and that mono slice in their teeth. They have a lot of teeth.
Yeah.
I use a lot of them year round, just because baits are expensive, right? And we live in the land of toothy critters. I personally like a tieable one. Berkeley makes a good one in a brand called Toothy Critter. And the nice part is it doesn't get the kinks that a metal leader will. So they're great for throwing on bass jigs. You can throw them on spinnerbaits, chatterbaits. And they don't really affect the action of the bait. And it's nice that you can adjust, you can cut it to the length that you want. I'm normally in that 4 to maybe a 6-inch. A spinnerbait or a chatterbait, because it's more of a reactionary bait, I'll have a little bit longer of a leader than say on a jig.
Thanks for that tip, Mandy. I want to go to a little different question here. Carp in Lake Minnetonka. Benji, you got any thoughts on that?
The carp are fun. I mean, they're, we had, I'm drawing a blank on his name. That Corey came and talked about rough fishing. So we actually have a video from a couple weeks ago in the Moss program, and Corey's talking all about rough fishing, and we'll give you some great tips on there. I see a lot of carp hanging out the bottom, just waiting for something to munch on. They're typically bottom feeders. You can catch them on a fly too. I know in Lake Calhoun right now is a prime time for fly fishing for carp. They'll come up towards the top and try to look for some bugs and whatnot swimming there. But if they're hanging lazily at the bottom in Lake Minnetonka, some kind of I don't know, a stinky dough ball is always something that they can
Worms
always on. Yeah, worms are always good that they can kind of smell out and get down there and gnaw on and drag them up. So
that relates to one of the earlier questions. Can fish smell? Yeah, right.
I saw that in there
Absolutely.
too, and I love Bill's question about he has a favorite lure that used to catch a lot of fish, and he put it in a spice container for safe storage, and it hasn't caught anything since. So I don't know what spice that was. Manny, maybe do you have a key spice that works good for fishing?
I don't use a spice, but a lot of the bass stuff, the plastics that you get, are going to they'll smell like garlic or they'll smell like anisette, like black licorice. And more than anything, smell comes into play when the fish is really finicky, right? Because they're gonna see it. They're gonna, if it's a softer plastic or a harder plastic. So if it's got a little bit of an oil to it, it's gonna mimic something more natural than a nasty piece of plastic, right? So I don't know about any special spices though. I might have to Google that one.
Maybe we
Yeah,
should do
Mark.
an experiment between like red peppers and allspice or something. We could Old Bay seasoning.
Mark asked a question. He's going to Cass Lake in June, and many of our lakes are clearing because of zebra mussels. Mandy or Craig, you're up in that area. Any advice for walleye or other species in June?
It's exceptionally clear. And it is for as big as it is and as shallow as it is. The crazy part is it's really slow to warm up because it is so clear. So that's going to be one factor. Two, because it is so slow to warm up, it's going to take longer for those vegetation lines to actually start to pop up and appear. This time of year when it's super cold, you're dealing with spawn. I would suggest early mornings and late night or low light situations or night. I've spent quite a few openers up there in the last few years, and we kind of go do what we want to do during the day, go crappie and sun fishing, and then at night we're actually out walleye fishing.
Cloudy days.
Yep.
Yeah, that wavy, the more wind, well, at least a little bit of wind to break that light down into the lake.
I'd recommend picking up a lake map too, so you got an idea of what the contour of that lake's going to be like, what area is going to be probably holding fish, and what areas might not be holding fish. Then you got your electronics on your boat. You can go out and find those spots and see if there's fish present. But I'd say fishing into that first part of June is not really that much different than fishing, the mid-May opener, because of the water temp. The clarity thing, yeah, that's an issue. Walleyes tend to go deeper when it's bright sunlight, Mandy. You'd agree?
Correct.
So they're very sensitive. I can't think of the fancy name the fishery guys down the hall give it, but maybe earlier in the morning or later in the evening to cut down on that bright sunlight in the lake.
Yeah, lake temp's a really good tip. Thank you, Craig. Pat asked about a multiple species tournament in a few weeks and one-day tournament. What should I go after? Well, first of all, I'd say, what are your rules, right? How many points do you get for what species? So, in the lake and what's got mostly. But with a one-day tournament, you're going to want to have to go after potentially, I would say, active fish. So using like a spinnerbait at this time of the year is a good option to cover a lot of water, especially if northerns and bass are high on the scoring. Andy, do you have any other tips on that?
Well, I'm wondering if he's fishing the Cross Lake Lions event. It is the largest multi-species event in Minnesota. It's out my back door, and I've actually won it before. I will be fishing it. So I fish multi-species leagues at night, but I also fish multi-species tournaments during the day. And what I'll normally do, depending what time of year it is, you have a really tight window if you're going to try and catch all the categories, so that you're going to have your 5 bass, your 4 walleye, and your 3 pike. So normally in the morning I'll go out, and that's when I'll try and get my walleye right away. The next I'm moving into my bass, and then I will spend the rest of the day literally trolling for pike. So that's what your comfort level is. If you're going to try and hit all of those species, there again depends what the water temp's doing. The ice is still on part of Cross Lake right now, north of us on some of those bigger bays. So that's really going to affect bass specifically for how I'm going to fish them or where that I'm going to fish them. But if you're super comfy on that lake and you're confident you can go out and get 5 bass right away, get your 5 bass and then wait till the end of the night for that species that's going to give you the most trouble.
So actually, we have a couple other questions about fishing for pike or northerns, and you said trolling. So what exactly are you doing? Live bait? Are you trolling crankbaits? What are you using for northerns? Or is it a top secret?
No.
Give something that would work.
So right now, with water temps this early, you're right spot on. I will either cast or I will troll large spinner baits for the pike. So I can cover a lot of water, you can get a lot of strikes, or I'll actually use a smaller version of a musky bait. It's called a bulldog, and it's a large plastic with treble hooks. There again, you can cast it or you can troll it. They really love them. Or here's a super secret, and a Wade's wobbler. Hands down, it could be one of the most deadly pike and musky baits there is out there. They come in multiple sizes. They're weighted, so they can either float on the top or get down, 12 to 18 feet. Those would be my 3 go-tos.
Great, good tips. Benji, I want to do a check-in. We still have 90 people and questions coming in. Do you think we should keep going? And if you guys have time, I'm game.
Yeah, we got a few minutes left. So
Okay.
yeah, we had a lot of trolling for northerns questions in there, which is always nice to see.
All right. If you don't have electronics, I think there was a question about what's a good way to find fish.
I put a link in there too to the lake finder. I'll put that up in the chat also that Carol asked, but Craig was talking about maps. I think that's probably, one of the best options if you don't have good electronics. One, local bait shops, talk to people, and maps. Look at the maps, find your drop-offs, find your points, pinch points, weed lines, anything you can do to help improve your success out there. So
yeah, those structure components that you just talked about, weeds, drop-offs, points, corners, cruise the lake. I mean, that's a really good thing to do. Just get out and look. A map will definitely help you, but you can see if fish are spawning potentially if the water's clear enough. You can see where the weeds are at, what kind of weeds there are. So that's just checking out the lake and seeing what's out there and what it looks like is a good. And then other animals, loons, fish that are birds that are feeding in certain areas, that they're usually attracted by bait fish. That can bring in the other fish too. So
I heard it's not a good idea to target those with your daredevils though, Jeff. So
the fish,
yeah.
I
Yeah, that's
actually did a
another
clinic up
talk
on
for
Lake
another time.
Lake Carlos with the interns, and the pelicans came in. We didn't catch a fish for 45 minutes. Once the pelicans were there, they all left. Of course, the fish left too. So I did want to ask one question. I think we skipped over. Sean was asking. He's way out in Michigan. He's coming over to fish Crooked Lake. I'm not for sure exactly where that is off the top of my head. Bass, walleye, pike fishing. Looking for any tips. He's going to have a small 12-foot boat in his kayaks with. So, anybody want to tackle that one?
If you're staying at a resort, talk to that resort owner and see what's been working on that lake up until the point that you get there. If you're not staying at a resort, you're staying at a campground, talk to the local bait shops. Those guys will talk fishing all day long if you let them. So that's one, local expert that you can do. The other thing you could consider is hiring a guide and go out and fish the lake with the guide and then get a few more days of fishing on your own. That would give you some indication of what's working, what kind of bait to use, what depths to fish. And you pay a little money out front, but you get the benefit of their expertise the rest of the week you're there.
Well, Andy talked all about live bait, and that's definitely a great option on many of our lakes in the summer on the weed lines. I would say spinnerbait for those aggressive fish, finding where they're active and finding the weeds. Start by finding the weeds, good submerged weed beds, and fish around those. Anything you want to add, Mandy?
Well, if it's the Crooked Lake that's in between Crosby and Brainerd, Minnesota, I'll give them a super tip. Wood. But it's easy to see. The lake is fairly clear there again. I'm not sure if that's the one specifically, but vegetation is normally late to come up because it's so slow to warm up, but it has a lot of wood. So find
Stumps and branches and
there's a
things
lot of
like that.
shoreline stumps, but structure is always good. You know, we get really focused on vegetation where we are because we have a lot of it. You know, if you go further north and you get into those northern lakes, you're not getting that vegetation like we do here or even further south. So then you're really back to focusing on structure. It can be large structure if it's reefs or points, man-made or not. So.
Yeah, rocks, changes in size of rocks and different kinds of rocks and boulders and things like that. Those can all be really, especially up north, we have a lot of smallmouth bass and they relate to a lot of rocky features.
Well, I think we covered a lot of ground in this hour. So if anybody does have some questions, you know, reach out to me and I can pass any questions on to the other folks on here. I do want to point out next week we have a walleye fishing for beginners talk with Nancy Cope. Is that how you say her last name?
Yeah.
And Linda and Linda from the boat program will be joining us too. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about specifically to walleye fishing, tune in next week. So
thank you everybody for joining us and sharing all your secrets. Hopefully people will get out and enjoy the opener.
Yeah, welcome to the summer vacation land season, right?
Yeah.
Get up north and get on some fish. So
There was one question
everybody
popped in about fishing the pools on Mississippi River, southern Minnesota. I've never fished a pool. There's too many swimmers usually in them.
You just had to get that joke in. That's the reason you wanted to do this question.
So Jeff, do you fish the pools?
I have not done a lot in the Mississippi River. Again, live bait, I've had some success. Jigs can be effective on points and drop-offs, but crankbaits, trolling crankbaits is really effective method for walleyes, especially in the Mississippi River. So I would check that option out too.
We got them all.
Find the wing dams.
Yep, those underground structure.
Yeah, the walleyes love them. The bass love them. Those are really good. This time of year, bass are actually, you know, trying to find the warmest water that there is because they're moving into spawn. You're going to have to get on the backwaters. So head to the further south pools on the Mississippi. If you're wanting to fish the walleye, I'd head north. I'd be heading up towards the big dam up there, and it's got a ton of wing dams. It's a great structure, and multiple species will be sitting on them.
Great. All right. With that, we can stop the recording and head to the back room. Thanks everybody for joining, and thanks to the presenters.